today I am chatting to Anshar Seraphim, and our theme this month is all about trust. Specifically the concept of know, like, and trust, but we've renamed it a little bit to call it Trust is Magic. Anshar, I'm not going to introduce you. You're going to tell us a little bit about you. You have quite an interesting grasp on trust and rapport building, negotiations, all that kind of things that put us as humans in touch with each other. So, yeah.
Yeah, my journey started with me being about 75% nonverbal at age 11 with my autism. And I had a lot of really big difficulties. One of them, of course, was sensory processing disorder, which is still a struggle for me as an adult. I can't handle more than one speaker at a time, listening to multiple voices because my brain isn't able to filter that input. I have synesthesia. So when a person touches me, especially unexpectedly, when I hear a lot of loud noise, there's so much, and that's why I didn't get my driver's license until I was about 37.
Oh.
It's because those challenges were so big for me.
Hmm.
And so starting at 75% nonverbal at 11, I felt incredibly socially isolated from everyone. I couldn't control the tone of my voice. It was constantly going up and down. I couldn't make eye contact with anyone. I spent most of my days walking around with my arms crossed, almost exactly in this position, actually. And I couldn't do more than just kind of look at where I was going. And I spent the first 25 years of my life like that, very isolated, only able to really hang out with other people when we shared an activity like a mutual interest. And I was so lonely. There's an isolation chamber, especially since I came from that age where, Asperger's had only been incorporated into the DSM just a couple of years before I graduated high school. So, I didn't get my diagnosis until I was 19 as a grown man. I think the average age of median diagnosis now is like 4 years old. So to think generationally about some of the differences that happen in the disability community, it was definitely a big challenge. And so when I finally got to 25 and I saw that I didn't have any of these social relationships that I wanted, and when I tried to interact with people, there's a tendency for people on the spectrum to switch the topic of conversation to their special interests because the lack of ability to avoid anxiety in social communication gives you a tendency to want to redirect topics to things that you feel more comfortable about. So I would just talk at people instead of with people, and then lack of social reciprocity is very difficult. And when you're neurodivergent, there's a lot of behavior that happens, depending on what kind of neurodivergent you are. And for neurotypical people, behavior is communication. So being able to separate the signifier and the signified in that way can be very difficult for some people, especially in like relationships and friendships. Person with autism, often if a person tries to share something emotionally with them, their way of empathizing is to share something that they relate to in that same way. But that step of actually acknowledging that the other person shared and validating their emotions doesn't happen. And so what I found was, especially for those first 2.5 decades, is that when I tried to connect to other people, I either came across as condescending or uninterested in them, or, and without them having any context, I ended up being kind of perceived as a jerk,
Yeah.
and that was really hard because I was already struggling. And then to have that negative social perception, not understand why it was happening. And so essentially I changed special interests, so often growing up, because I would kind of go all the way through with something and then move it to something else. And so I decided, if that was going to be a part of my life anyway, that maybe I should just make my autistic special interest psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And that's what I did.
And communication specifically, really, is it not?
I think that going through the process of understanding where people's actions and reactions come from, understanding the psychological modalities that are involved in interpersonal interaction, I think that secondary goal of communication just slowly kind of raised as a water level on its own. from understanding the context of other people. And it was in that process that I learned just how important and dynamic trust is. And it's even wired into our brains, which we can get
Yeah.
into. But that whole journey, eventually led me to continually challenge myself, be putting myself into situations where I had to develop empathy, where I had to, do more than just mask and pretend to be someone else. And masking, if you're not familiar, when you're neurodivergent, is just this process of doing your very best to appear neurotypical, to be able to kind of, blend in. The problem with that, though, is it's an inherently dishonest social behavior, and you don't prepare other people to react properly when you do have symptoms that you're not able to, to resist, or to stop yourself from exhibiting. So one of the metaphors that I give a lot, not to pick on Tourette's, but people with Tourette's, I think there's only like a 2.5% incidence of people actually swearing or saying things that are socially inappropriate. But just for the sake of argument, if a person has Tourette's and they are one of those 2.5%, and they manage to mask themselves, and you're having a conversation or getting to socially interact, and then, even if you do great for half an hour and then something slips, then you haven't provided the other person the framework to be able to react authentically to, you accidentally, swearing or saying something socially appropriate. So eventually I learned that I had to take the onus onto myself and be willing to share my challenges with other people in order to be able to start, taking those successive Kierkegaardian leaps to being able to change. And that was an interesting process. And I learned that when you positively share your challenges, if you can be excited about sharing and positive about them, and just let them know, hey, if this happens or that happens, it has nothing to do with you, but please, let me know so that I can, put my hand on the steering wheel. And that process, it took some humility, but it really allowed me to kind of, grow and stop being afraid of my own shadow and start to extend my social relationships. So when I got to 30, I went into the jewelry industry of all things, because before that I had been an academic tutor at a college, which was interesting because it was a satellite campus of a main campus, and I was the only academic tutor at a college for like 2 years. I tutored every subject, so that was really cool. Got a lot of really cool exposure to people and information, but it was also my first foray into helping other people with disabilities, which was really rewarding. And so when I got into my 30s, I went into the jewelry industry. And at first, I was just a salesperson. I mean, I had been in information technology for a very long time before that. And here I was in an emotionally driven industry selling a product that has a purely emotional and social value.
Yeah.
And I had to completely reframe so many things. And I think one of the cool things about doing that when you work, like a full-time retail sales job, is it gives you the immersion that you need. It's like going and living in another country and learning to speak another language. And here I was on a daily basis having to, work on my communication skills and my emotional sapience and being able to properly respond to social cues. And it was a trial by fire. And I never expected myself to excel in that environment. I just wanted to learn from it. And eventually I was running my own $2.5 million store. And then I was doing all the training for communication and psychosocial emotional dynamics for the Pacific Northwest, for the largest retail jewelry store in the United States. And did that for, going 8 years. And that whole process, I mean, I had to break it down and systemize it in a way that, for a person where those skills came naturally, that wouldn't happen. But the process of me doing that and having my cup be empty gave me a lot of insight into the kinds of changes that people need to make in order to work on their communication skills for my own process. And then from there, I started helping people in other industries. And now this is what I do for a living. I teach applied behavioral psychology and applied cognitive neuroscience, psychosocial dynamics, and getting to see that moment of anagnosis with people when I'm on a call with them and they just, it hits them and they get it. And it starts to change their approach, and they see the different steps that they have to put into self-development, and then they get to enjoy those same results that I did and wanting to come out of my shell, come out from under my rock. So that's been incredibly rewarding. And it was a process of personal development. I wasn't doing it for a piece of paper. I'm not a clinician or anything like that, but I I have been studying psychology now for 17 years, and I read, scientific abstracts and research articles, and that's part of my daily, consumption of knowledge. So
Mm.
it's been a humbling process, but it's been incredibly rewarding. And I'm proud to say that I advocate for, neurodiversity in the workplace. I'm part of this amazing nonlinear thinking group called the Octopus Movement.
Yes.
So that's great with Dr. Perry. That's been
Yeah.
fantastic. And just meeting all kinds of great people, getting to hear, the stories of other nonlinear and neurodivergent people, and getting that sense of that difficulty to fit in, but also to be able to gain the trust of people that, we're not necessarily like. And I think that's taught me a lot, not necessarily about who I am, but also who we all are and what we all have in common, no matter how neurotypical or neurodivergent we are.
Yeah. And you made me think now, what was that thing that pushed you out of that comfort zone? Because I mean, to come from where you were on that nonverbal scale, not knowing what really was going on, there was no diagnosis, there was no label that you could help to use to understand these things that you were going through. So those first steps must have been quite uncomfortable, to put it mildly.
I think there's a certain point, if you're introverted and you prefer your own company and you like quiet because of sensory issues. I mean, me with synesthesia, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things that go on with synesthesia. Like if I hear a certain tone of noise, for example, auditory input, I'll actually feel it all over my entire body.
Yeah.
So it created some really challenging situations for me. But I think that, comfort's the enemy of achievement. If you're constantly surrounding yourself in situations where you're comfortable, then you have no desire to grow. And for me, once I got to that point where I was just so lonely, I think that loneliness is what kind of made me willing to cross the desert, whether I was sure if I had enough water or not to do it. And it got me out of my comfort zone. And I realized that the more time that you spend putting yourself into challenging social situations, then the more of a need you have to develop those skills, and it becomes important. But that's also when I started to observe peer dynamics, because being socially isolated the entire first half of my life, I didn't understand the importance to the human animal about moving in that sense of tribality. If you look at them anthropologically speaking, in almost every religion that's out there, it all starts with, we are the chosen people.
Yeah.
Whether you're looking at the Popol Vuh from, Central and South America, or you're going over and looking, at something else like an Abrahamic religion. And I think that tribal sense of survival, that pack mentality, the peer influence, I didn't understand how important and how intense that dynamic was, because I started outside of it. And so it was very striking when I first came into social situations and actually got to see that dynamic at work, and got to sit around people, who are in relationships and friendships, and watch them interact and see those effects, kind of almost like a anthropologist in a pith helmet. It was definitely a different experience, but it did teach me what I had as a goal, where I had to go.
Yeah, that sense of belonging is kind of something that's inherent, I think, within that tribal community, or that tribality, as you say.
It's interesting because there has been a very interesting change in the sociological dynamics of the world. It depends culturally from country to country. I can only speak about, my experience here in the States. I have been out of the country a few times, but I think the modern world has separated us in many ways. We've also had that intellectual concept of a shortening of distance from the technology of travel, but it hasn't necessarily changed our interconnectedness. And one of the things I noticed was when, like, September 11th happened here in the States. Obviously we had a pretty dramatic loss of life, and it was a big deal, and it was on every news channel. But I noticed that during that same time period, we had, Boko Haram and all kinds of other things going on that had much bigger losses of life. And yet it wasn't on the news, and it wasn't resonating. And I started asking myself, well, why is that? And the answer is peer dynamics. When people are able to see people that are like themselves, they have a lot more empathy and care about what's going on and why it affects them. And that's when I kind of backed up a little bit and started to look at other things, like our ability to enjoy like watching sports, for example, which for me as an autistic guy, I'm not really into that too much. But you know, it occurred to me that when a neurotypical person's like watching a sports event and you start engaging mirror neurons, and it is a person that's like you, and it is from your cultural background, that in a way, when you're watching them, you know, run on the field or whatever, that your brain is running on the field with them. And
Yeah.
that's one of those things that makes that so exciting for people. It's this kind of it's a cerebral experience, whether they know it or not. And so it's been very instructive. And I think that I didn't understand how much until I got into cognitive neuroscience. I didn't understand all of the underpinning biomechanisms that are responsible for that. And that's been really cool too. Everything from, you know, like the uncanny valley where we, you know, see like a human face that isn't quite right. It triggers that lower brain response and maybe like a camouflage predator or something like that, where it kind of makes us uneasy. Identifying the effects, the sociological and psychological effects that happen in between groups, and how that involves trust and where trust comes from. That's always been a really fascinating topic. And you know, that's why when you were talking about the whole idea of trust as magic, I was intrigued, because it is a very interesting psychological topic.
Yeah, it is. And it is it's a point of connection as well, isn't it? Because as you say, I need to see a bit of me in you for me to really connect with you so that I can trust you. But my instinctive mind is always going to look for, is there danger in this situation? So yeah, what do you say about that? How do we usually find that trust in someone or something?
So on a simplistic level,
Mm.
right, the axonic and dendritic connections of the brain, the really biomechanically speaking, we're a relational computer. You know, rather than, you know, like a binary system of one of zeros, we tend to associate the things that we see and interact with and experience with our past experiences in order to be able to create a narrative, but also to give us a default mode of cognition toward the thing that we're looking at. We walk into a room, we see a flat surface with four legs on it, and our brain creates the assumption that it's a table, even though we haven't seen that particular table before. And it's only when we get new information that allows us to reframe that we take a second look at that thing. And it might be a simplistic metaphor, but in many ways, social interaction is very much the same. You know, our brain is categorizing and grouping things together that it's able to associate. And then it's only after that process happens that we're able to, you know, move something closer or further away toward our peer group. And that changes the way that we interact with it, but it also triggers cognitive reframing that allows us to consider the individual as opposed to the group. And I think that's where a lot of sociological manifestations like racism and prejudice and stuff, you know, it comes from the fact that the brain is constantly trying to make associations. And I think that in the process of examining that's where the hippocampus came in when we started talking about memory. You know, because the primal instinctive evolutionary modality of memory is triggered by stress. You know, as we get a rise in cortisol and adrenaline, and, you know, we're put into a stressful situation, the brain goes into hyper recording mode because that's beneficial for our survival. But it doesn't necessarily give us good facility as thinking, feeling human beings. You know, that's more of a modern thing. So the fact that your brain, you know, and psychologists disagree, it's anywhere from 3 to 25 times the primacy with a negative experience, but it's true evolutionarily speaking. You know, a lion chases us up a tree, the brain doesn't want you to forget that. You know, no one spends, you know, wakes up at 2:30 in the morning with one eye open thinking about that job interview 10 years ago that went well, right? So it's interesting because the brain favors negative processing for self-protection. And that means that when we have an intense negative experience, even if the actual percentage chance of that experience actually occurring is, you know, 1%, 2%, 5%, we will start to restructure our belief systems and our boundaries and our level of trust and all of that in order to feel a sense of safety after a negative experience that we remember. And positive experiences are often lost. That's one of the reasons that a positive mindset and taking the time to celebrate accomplishments and achievements and all of that is so important, is that you have to counteract the natural evolutionary system of the brain. Otherwise, you will live a life where the only things that you remember are bad things.
Yeah.
And that will warp your belief systems, and it will warp the way that you group people together, and it will warp your prejudice, and it will warp, what you're willing to expose yourself to. It'll warp your ability to trust. It's not about ignoring those primal signals of stressors and apprehension that we get. It's about understanding them in context and trying to build a system of our own memory to be able to balance the memory, so that when our brain does make those associations before we're able to move someone in and out with peer dynamics, that we have the ability to do it authentically with real information, and not a cognitive bias that is there because of negative primacy in the memory. And I think that's a really interesting social effect too.
Yeah. And there's two things that come up for me. The cognitive dissonance is one of my favorite concepts. I mean, not favorite, it's just a very interesting thing that humans do, especially when they feel threatened. So I'm not going to accept that new information, because then I need to change all my belief systems, and I can't cope with that, which is very much on that line as well. Maybe the opposite of...
It's the three brains fighting. Yeah,
that's the second part that I wanted to come to.
Yeah.
There's not this Western world that we sadly is so much more exposed to than that our full holistic kind of being is so focused on the head, and that being our only defense in survival or for survival. But there are other brains involved as well. So yeah, tell me more about it from your perspective.
Well, I mean, when you get into the lower brain, you get all of those primitive impulses, instincts, natural biomechanical reactions, like that moment in the uncanny valley where we recognize that maybe we've been lured into a situation that's not authentic, right?
Yeah.
Because maybe we're about to be ambushed, right? Yeah. And then we get into, the amygdala and emotions, and that starts to affect us systemically, our endocrinology, all of that. It changes our ability to react. And then it's only then that we move into the higher brain functions. We get into the PFC, and then we're able to evaluate our impulses and then make authentic decisions. But you have to pay respect to that process. There's an old saying by Jonathan Swift. He said that you can't reason someone out of a position that they didn't use reason to get to in the first place. And I think that we have to recognize the evolutionary and emotional systems that can take a person, closer or further away from trust and take care of that objection differently before you're able to move into the logic of a decision. Because we see things in our environment that we want, we have the impulse, and then that's, it puts us through, Brodmann's Area 9 and 46, and we actually process, and weigh that information. Do we, is this going to be good for us? Is this going to give us the long-lasting value? Or what are the drawbacks of this decision? It's only then that we're able to do that. And paying deference to those steps, those different systems of the brain, and understanding that there's kind of a pearl there that has multiple layers before you can kind of get to the middle. It does change, I think, the understanding of the way that people make decisions, but it also helps you process your own process of trust.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's other aspects to it too. If we leave the brain and to the side, there's also the heart and the gut, that intuition, which is a little bit of a esoteric, maybe, a little bit out of the box kind of
I always
thing.
describe it as a transition between the lower brain and the middle brain. And we're moving from that reptilian reaction to instinctive emotion, and it's somewhere in between. And I think that sometimes that gut feeling comes from biomechanical systems in the brain, like the uncanny valley or mirror neurons or something like that. And then then it starts to go higher, and then it mixes in with emotion. And being aware of those emotional influences on your own interpersonal dynamics, I think, is super important, because it can cause you to have a reaction before you're able to react to your reaction. and you can end up changing, the way that you're interacting with someone, for example. So I think that's definitely important.
Yeah. And how you approach a situation can also be affected by that, I think, sometimes. So let's come back to one of my favorite topics, and we kind of touched on it in our messages around mirror neurons specifically, and how important or what a role they play in us building rapport and trust with our audience, or people that we want to work or have relationships with in general.
So starting at a basic level, neurobiological researchers, they started measuring the brains of primates, specifically I think it was the macaque and the bonobo with some of the initial research that they did. And they noticed that the same area of the brain would light up when one primate was watching another, let's say, eat a piece of fruit, that same region of the brain would light up as if they themselves were eating a piece of fruit. And that effect only happens when we see someone who's in our actual peer group. That feeling, that activity is strengthened by the intensity of that social connection. So when we get into the nuts and bolts of how that effect actually manifests itself, psychologists and neuroscientists can disagree sometimes on the impact and whether or not it's specifically mirror neurons or it's interacting with something else, or there's multiple dependent systems. But I think for the purpose of application, that's largely irrelevant. And the reason is that there's a demonstrable social effect, there's a demonstrable cognitive reaction. And if we go off of, evidence-based in that way, and recognize that is an effect that is led by the brain for us for behavior, it gives you the pause to understand that the more that we can see someone as like us, the more that we have the ability to empathize with them, the more that we tend to reframe their words, their actions, the levels of suspicion. We get past some of the gatekeepers of suspicion that happen in a new situation. And I think the metaphor for the effect that I like to use that's easiest for people to understand is that if you get a group of really good friends and you have them in like a circle and they're talking and something happens to one of them, let's say, something silly, like someone gets kicked in between the legs, let's say, you'll see a physical reaction in the people that are in that peer group as they watch that happen, and that happens because that person is close enough to us that those mirror neurons are engaged, and we actually have a physiological reaction to watching them go through an experience. And so that changes, and that's why we're able to enjoy watching a reaction video on YouTube, or we want to watch sports, or because there's that sense of social belonging. But also when we're watching those experiences, we actually get to enjoy a version of that ourselves. And that's really evolutionarily favored just because of that tribalism, those packs. If you have two groups of primates and one goes off in that direction, one goes off in that direction, they're not going to care nearly as much about the other group's survival as they do about their own. That in order for the genes to perpetuate, that has to be so. So understanding that dynamic, leveraging it in communication, leveraging it in understanding and trust, and getting past objections and being able to build close relationships. That's why it all starts with getting them to reframe you as someone that is more like them, because you give them the ability to care.
Yeah. So there's empathy involved in that, because if I feel like I see you as a part of me, then I feel your feelings as well in that process.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because it gets involved in the temporal too, because psychologists have known for a long time that your body language and your facial expressions and your mannerisms, that not only do they convey meaning, but they can actually change the framework of your own emotions as you're doing them. So, say if you're having a bad day, smile. If you are going through that process of doing those reactions, it literally starts to change your mindset, because those are interconnected systems. And I think that there is, and we haven't gotten to the level of the brain yet, but I would theorize that mechanism is a part of what's going on with mirror neurons, that parts of our brain are lighting up as if we are doing that action, having that body language, having that facial expression ourselves. And then it starts to affect our ability to emotionally relate to the person that we're talking to. So, and I've noticed this effect as I've been teaching people to move in and out of peer groups and change their communication style and focus on their pace and their focus, and understanding, cultural idioms like personal space, how that can change via population concentration, and because all of those boundaries are evolved, socially. So if you start to interact with someone from a different social context, it can be easy to make mistakes. One of my favorite books, and it is an older book, it's kind of like the Masters and Johnson, but of body language, is by Barbara and Alan Pease, Pease.
Yeah.
And one of the things he talked about is he talked about watching video of a conference, and there was a Texas oil magnate and a Japanese businessman. And here you have a person who grew up in a very rural environment and a person who grew up in a very urban environment. And a person from a very rural environment, they'll lean all the way into your space and will give you a handshake. And a person who's grown up in, high population density, they'll walk right up to you to get into your space to give you a handshake. And that's the distance that they want to be to interact, because that is intimacy to them. Mm. So he said that, when you put the video on high speed, you could actually see them waltzing around the conference room, because the Japanese businessman would be trying to get in closer in order to be able to get intimacy. And then the Texas guy's like, whoa, you're in my space. But this process was happening without them doing it intentionally. So he got to see these unconscious movements, this unconscious yo-yoing around the room. And it shows you how those different contexts can have a really big effect, not just on the conscious part of it, but there are unconscious processes that are involved in trust and peer dynamics, and understanding the strength and power of those, because as we've discussed, when we're stuck in the lower brain, we can't get to the higher brain. Yeah. So being able to change some of those paradigms, I think, is crucial to being able to have a real understanding of what changes our trust dynamics, what gives people the ability to reframe us as being more like them, and then starting to see the incredible effects that happen as a result of that.
Mm. And for me, there's a lot of vulnerability in that process, because for me to show my true, authentic self to you so that you can see yourself, I need to be vulnerable in that process.
Yeah, I think that we get a little wrapped up in this idea of authenticity. I think that when a person thinks of changing the way that they come across, sometimes there's this tendency to view it as not being authentic, or not being their individual person. And it's not like that. It's like going to another country and trying to communicate with someone in your native language, and then being frustrated with them for not being able to understand what you're saying. It's not that who you are needs to change. It's about the presentation, the communication, the framework, and understanding the dynamics at play. And it's only by being willing to understand that when you move into communicating with another person, that you have an onus of responsibility to change your style so that you're speaking the same language. That doesn't have anything to do with who you are. It has to do with effective communication, because effective communication isn't about communicating ideas. It's about being heard and being understood. And that's a two-person process. And one of the things I talk about a lot is listening. I think a lot of the training for active listening is very upside down. People are like, oh yeah, you need to nod and ask one-line questions to show that you're listening. And no, that's a terrible approach for listening. But I think that maybe it's that building block step to finally get to the finish line. But I find that if you listen with the goal of being able to understand from their framework why they believe what they do, and what considerations and process went into that decision, and then you're able to demonstrate that you understand that, even if you don't agree with the conclusion. I think we all have this common misapprehension of being misunderstood. And people would agree with me if they only understood my point of view. And, they just can't get it through their thick heads, And if you can show the other person that you have a complete grasp of how they got there, that they were, showing their work socially, and that you were able to follow their steps, then you'll find that you'll be able to ask them if there's anything more, and they won't have anything else to say, because you validated their process and their conclusion, whether or not you agree with it. And if they can see that you understand all of the process of synthesis for them to be able to get to the position that they have, they're far more likely to listen to you if you have a contrasting perspective. And I think too many of us are listening, waiting to talk, you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then, you know, when we try to work on active listening, we use these kind of outmoded, you know, listening techniques that kind of give a person a nod, don't really make them feel validated, especially cognitively validated. And I think that changes that dynamic. And there's a saying that I really like in psychology. You know, if you're having a problem with a friend, or you're having a problem with a romantic partner, are you trying to, when you're trying to communicate something, like maybe you're frustrated, are you trying to tell that jerk, or are you trying to tell your friend? Because you can't do both at the same time. You know, if the goal of you communicating is for you to feel better, well, that's not the same goal as getting buy-in, understanding, or being able to share thoughts, ideas, empathy, and being able to get onto the same page. You know, those are two different goals. And I think much of the toxic behaviors that happen, whether they're in business or relationship, you know, interpersonally, are from us not feeling understood or validated for our feelings. And then once we have given up on the process of communication, then we try to force them to feel like we're feeling. They can't empathize with us, and so we want to force that empathy on them. You know, I'm feeling betrayed. You won't acknowledge the feeling that I'm feeling betrayed. So now I'm going to make you feel betrayed, because now you are feeling, you are feeling what I'm feeling. You know, you've hurt my feelings. You can't seem to understand that you've hurt my feelings. So now I'm going to insult you or bring up your mother or whatever. And now you are feeling what I'm feeling. And that makes me feel a little better, because nothing helps a bad mood like spreading it around. Right. So,
but it doesn't really help the communication process, because no one has proceeded in any kind of direction.
And that's where that question of, are you trying to tell your friend, or are you trying to tell that jerk? Because you can't do both. You can't. And I think that recognizing that human want to be understood can actually become negative, and that you can try to force empathy on other people if you get frustrated. And asking yourself the intended goal and whether or not your approach is actually going to get you there. Because as not great as it is to say, if you're currently experiencing negative emotions and framework because of another person, you may have to put extra effort in as the person who's been aggrieved to be able to get them to understand what it is that they've done and why. And if you do that with the intention of improving your interaction, your relationship, and your understanding, and not to feel better, because having to go through the steps of explanation and synthesis to get another person on the right page, that might make you feel worse at first. You know, when I give longer talks, I talk about the process of apologizing. And there are certain things that you have to hit in an apology, but it depends on the person. Again, we have this problem of the golden rule that we're taught all the time: treat other people the way that you want. I mean, other people aren't us.
No,
you know, that's where we go to that platinum rule of learning how to treat other people based on the way that they need to be treated. And it can be frustrating, for example, to teach someone how you need to be apologized to, or to let someone know that you need to be apologized to, because initially there is a loss of power, right? Because there's a desire for the other person to have humility and recognize that they've hurt you. But maybe the fact that you've prompted that apology the first time, maybe it makes that apology have less weight. Maybe it makes you a little bit frustrated or angry that you had to explain the fact that they hurt you in the first place. But then think about the information that you've given them going forward. Maybe that first apology won't feel authentic because it's prompted, but then you've given them the tools for the rest of your interaction to recognize the way that you need to be apologized to. And I think that people aren't always necessarily willing to get from the midbrain to the high brain, go from emotions to actually thinking and realize that their normal social reactions are actually antagonistic to the long-term outcome of feeling better socially.
And it brings me back to the being right. I want to, if I just want to show you that I'm right, by going through that process. And that's where I find there's a lot of issues within listening or understanding, or the whole kind of process is, what if no one has to be, what if there isn't a right and a wrong? What if there is just different perspectives of this human experience?
I think that right and wrong is, at first I believed in absolute systems of morality, like many of us did. I think I got to that age of reason as a child, and my grandmother was a church organist and a bell choir director, and I just moved from church to church to church to church as I was, growing up, just because she was a music director. And so I had that moment of realizing that adults had very firmly held personal opinions and beliefs that were not congruent with one another very early on, a lot earlier of an age than I probably would have otherwise, especially with ASD.
Yeah.
But I recognized that personal truth is the rubric that we use for right and wrong existentially, and that personal truth, that valence of personal experience, it's basically all cognitive bias, but it's just because that's the best tool that we have. When we look at the human senses, the human brain is not really that well equipped to provide us any kind of insight on truth. Our temporal lobe and the spatial part of our brain, it helps us move around and navigate our environment and all of that, but this desk isn't solid. These are just different vibratory rates of molecules and with different amounts of association, composed mostly of empty space. The colors that I see are actually the colors that are not being absorbed by the thing. It's the opposite, right? The image that goes to my brain is actually upside down, and my brain is filling in the gaps for all of the blood vessels and stuff that are in my retina, and it over a process of time learns to blur those things together so that I can see the frequency at which I hear, the part of the visible spectrum that I see. Because the truth is, we're all just one continuous, flow of molecules with varying amounts of density. And that, we're more like two different pieces of the same blanket looking at one another, thinking that we're different. And the reason that we have to think that we're different is that we have the evolutionary system to allow us to be able to continue to develop and promulgate our genes and all of that. And that's a required perspective of the brain. Otherwise, we can't make individual decisions, and therefore there's no natural selection. So the evolutionary system of the brain requires us to have a narrative as individuals. But as to whether or not that's actually true, because the truth is that we're hurtling through, the galaxy at, tens of thousands of, whatever units you use. I'm sorry, I'm in the States here, forgive that. And, we send things to space that sometimes get there. So, but the idea that, I'm actually on the surface of, of an obloid spheroid that's going, super fast, and that is in turn going around the spiral arms of the galaxy, that in turn is, the supercluster. And, my illusion of being in one place in this room is anything but true. Exactly. My sense as an individual, anything but true. The colors that I see, another person could be in this room that has a different number of cones and rods in their eyes, different number of neurons in the occipital, different variegations in the in the retina, and we could look and point at the same thing and say that's a red plant, and have two completely different visual impressions of that. But because we've spent our whole lives pointing at that color and calling it red, that's our communication. But you ever considered the fact that we might actually be seeing completely different colors? We have this idea of truth, and like I said, the brain doesn't necessarily give us a good window to truth. What it does is it tries to filter out all of the information that is mostly irrelevant so that we can propagate our genes and have nothing, because that everything else is predicated on that system. And when you can recognize that, you start to understand the biomechanisms of cognitive belief, of social dynamics, of all of that. Because if you start asking yourself the question, well, what has caused this biomechanism or this behavior or this chemical reaction to rise up? Where does the uncanny valley? That's a really cool effect. Where does it come from? Camouflage predators. Wait, it's really interesting. I don't care about this person with a different skin color, what happens to them, nearly as much as I care about my neighbor across the street. Why is that? Well, mirror neurons, pair dynamics, the pack mentality of primates. All of these things are underpinning systems, and I get into that. I think it's important when you start to study evolutionary psychology. I mean, this whole process for me, one of the things that started it was reading The Dragons of Eden by Carl Sagan.
Oh.
And he talks about the evolutionary systems that give birth to the human brain and why that's so important. And I think it's one of the things that got me fascinated and let me kind of start to move that searchlight of autistic special interest to this venue, is being able to understand where those systems come from gives you the context that you need also to stop blaming people. Because if you can recognize that they're literally seeing a different color than you, and that the difference in the problem in communication that you're having is because of an effect that has nothing to do with them, I think of it as, and this is where my patience with people changed. I like thinking of everyone as neurodivergent, because in a way we are.
We are.
We all
I agree
have different
completely.
genetic backgrounds and different, tribal and pack mentalities with different genes and different life experiences and different, cognitive belief systems and different intensities, emotional reaction. Our average dopamine levels are different, so our impulse control is affected. Our corpus callosal thickness is different. We have different amounts of ability to be able to go between, activities that involve both hemispheres of the brain. We've got, so many things, and yet you want to point a finger at that person and call them a jerk.
Yeah.
But if you went through exactly their life with their same set of genes, their same experiences, their same reactions, overreactions, cognitive biases, would you be that different of a person? Would you make that different of decisions? And are you sure? And I think that process is humbling, because it takes us to this point of, this person disagrees with me and they're my enemy and they're in opposition with me, but rather that they have had an authentic experience that leads them to a different personal truth. And the intensity of that experience is now causing the reaction that they're having now. And if I want them to see my perspective, I need to validate theirs.
Yeah.
And that's a different process for communication. And it takes people out of that whole, I think it was Sir Francois de Rochefort. He said, people are often more treacherous through weakness than they are through calculation. That it is our own process of seeking the path of least resistance and having authentic responses to trauma and all of that. They're not doing that to you because of you. They're doing it to you because of them.
Yeah.
And I think that changes your perspective. It makes you take things less personally. It becomes easier to answer that question of, am I telling that jerk or am I telling my friend?
Exactly. Yeah. And that is what trust is I think there's, for me personally, there's so much story involved in it as well. If I understand, or I can listen to your story, I can put myself in your shoes in as much as I can, cognitively. But I also have then a feeling for you. I have a strong belief that our hearts are where we make that connection and where we get to create that trust.
I think one of the examples I use when I'm talking about cognitive bias is I talk about this example of a person like watching TV, falling asleep on the couch, and they have this incredible dream where they're this, woman in the 18th century, with all this stuff going on in their family life, and then they like lose their kids, and the kids die, and then the husband dies, and you wake up after having this really intense dream, and you get out your dream journal and you write down all this stuff before it fades from your memory, and you get really curious about the fact that you have this dream, and maybe you dream it a few more times, And then eventually, you're going to take a trip to another country or something like that. And you're going to end up being near this place that you had a dream about. And there's that curiosity. And then you go through your own organic process and you go to that country, and then you go to the address or the place that you had a dream about, even though you'd never been there. And there it is. And then you go to the cemetery and you see the names of the kids and the years and all the stuff that your dream is confirmed. Yeah. And you will spend the rest of your life believing in reincarnation because you fell asleep watching the History Channel. So there is a desire by the brain to make connections and conclusions. And that unique process, until that person gets to look at that experience through a different lens, that is truth to them. Mm-hmm. And not acknowledging that that is truth to them by virtue of everything that they went through in that experience, and that there's only steps of that process that they failed to consider that ultimately led them to the wrong conclusion. Getting out of that mindset of labeling people as wrong or ignorant, or it's just that their unique experience has given them cognitive biases, cognitive models, and reactions that have triggered some of their evolutionary systems, but also some of their social systems, and led them to the place that they're at. And taking someone else's negative assessment or their, whatever, personally, it serves no purpose.
Yeah. And that can be influenced by the narrative that we expose ourselves to as well. When we listen to the news, or to a right wing or left wing or whichever other wing there is, opinion of whatever it is, people in Turkey or people that have a different skin color or whatever, so if we open ourselves to those kind of narratives, that also has an influence on our perception and cognitive biases. So I think for me personally, I can't even listen to the news because I find it completely overwhelming and one direction of narrative that I don't always agree with, but that's the choice I can make.
It's a group of people that are not in charge of their own reactions, making entertainment for other people who are not in charge of their own reactions.
Yeah, so exactly.
It's a bit like watching a circus, and you're just like, where's the bear going on that unicycle? I don't understand. And why is everyone booing? I don't get it. So, and then of course from that we have to get into trauma, and whether it's a narcissistic relationship or the death of a parent or a spouse, or an intensely negative, or a bully that follows us home from school and hits us in the head with a rock, whatever it is that happens to us, understanding the evolutionary primacy to negative emotion, understanding that that is going to start to warp our belief system, because the brain naturally is going to try to avoid getting that kind of stimulation again. And you have to throttle that effect, because let's say 1 in 20 people is the kind of person who's going to hurt you. If you get a really negative experience and you're hurt by someone, or maybe 2 people in a row and you had really bad luck, you might start to redraw your entire set of social boundaries and your beliefs about people and your ability to trust others, and all of that based on small sample size, which creates its own cognitive bias. But then you have that evolutionary bias of emotional primacy, and it will affect your ability to trust. It'll affect your ability to trust people in relationships. And understanding that, there are elements of that are very, very difficult to avoid. And when you talk to someone, who actually has like PTSD, for example, you start to understand that these different levels of the brain, before we're able to have, different kinds of reactions, that you'll start having primal reactions in the lower brain and in the midbrain before you're able to really cogitate. So you'll be like, why am I feeling anxious? I don't understand why my body is having this response. That's what having PTSD is like. Is you don't realize that when something really bad, maybe you were in this terrible car accident, it was raining really hard, the next time that you go to take a shower, you might just be, singing to yourself, trying to, use the soap or whatever. And then all of a sudden you start getting into fight or flight, and you feel like the whole world is going to crumble down, and you don't know why. And that's because those systems have primacy in the order in which they interact. And being able to understand that framework and understand how it can warp not just your bias, but also your belief systems, and how those belief systems. And one of the most important things about celebrating positive experiences when you have triumphs, when you have milestones, is that negative stuff, your brain is going to do that without you putting any effort.
Yeah.
But if you don't invest the time, effort, and energy into celebrating and making distinct and memorable your positive accomplishments, those are going to be lost in the sea of that mental memory, and that will affect who you are. It will affect, this is where imposter syndrome comes from, in my opinion, is that people have an entire lifetime of only remembering their most negative experiences, their failures, their inability to be able to reach a goal. And so when they finally do get something that is achievable enough that their brain is constantly reminded of it, they feel as if they don't belong there, as if they didn't actually earn it, as if they're secretly not competent enough to be there. And then, of course, we have the flip side, which is like Dunning-Kruger, where we don't know enough to recognize that we don't have sapience on something, that our ability to estimate our own skills is lacking. And then we'll think that we're, all that, and have just a tiny sliver of understanding and not recognize that we only have a sliver of understanding. So there is a spectrum there, and seeing the different intense reactions that can happen on both ends of it, it does give credence to that idea of being balanced.
Yeah. Just now when you were talking about trauma as well, I mean, I don't know if you know Gabor Mate's work with around kind of generation, or the possibility of generational trauma that we might carry with us also, which might have an influence on our biases or our reactions to situations and people.
I think when we get into epigenetics, when we get into I think that there are triggered systems in the brain too. It's like an alert, and once it gets to a certain point, it triggers a response. And I didn't always think of it this way, but it was learning more about ADHD actually that got me interested in that. Just because, what people fail to understand is that in a person who has ADHD, there's dopamine starvation going on. And the reason that it's so important is that when your brain has very low dopamine, it's kind of, dopamine response is kind of like a muscle. And when it first starts to flex is when it's strongest. So when you first get that impulse, but your dopamine level is low, it becomes a very strong impulse. It starts to override other things, distract from things, versus when that level's higher, there's less for it to move, and then that response is attenuated. So that's why, you put a person with ADHD into an environment and that they have the reactions that they do. And that's why we have the pharmacological approaches that we do. That's why we've been trying different treatment things and reuptake and all kinds of stuff that we try to, and it's funny because one of the most efficacious is to just give them a stimulant, but then of course you start to empty out, the body's natural reserves. And if you try to replace, the dopamine with a chemical that shares some of its receptors, like, tetrahydrocannabinol or something like that, it doesn't selectively trigger them the same way, which means we get these, every idea feels profound and we can't get rid of our hunger and we're thirsty all the time. And, having an understanding of the mechanisms that are happening and why, it's kind of like divorcing yourself from your own narrative for a moment and trying to recognize your unique starting point and where it's causing some of the reactions and stuff that it is. Like, have you gotten to examine any of the research on rejection sensitive dysphoria?
No.
So RSD is it is one of the manifestations that happens with ADHD. And the differences in a person's brain who has ADHD, it actually makes it harder for them to be able to process this phenomenon. And that is that, and this is going to your point about triggered, or even familiar genetic memory. You get negatively socially evaluated when you're neurodivergent all the time. And in relationships, especially in friendships, people with ADHD struggle. And it's because a lot of the dopamine-led responses and other things that happen in social reciprocity becoming incredibly difficult for them. It becomes incredibly difficult to remember someone's birthday. It becomes incredibly difficult, when a person is telling a story, to remember that they need to be validated, and then to be able to fight with the impulsive thought that you just had, intrusive thought that you just had as a result of what they were saying. And we can forget the goal of making that other person feel heard, that initial surge, that first bicep flex of dopamine. It actually makes it take primacy over that other thing. And it makes it very, very easy to hurt that other person's feelings, to make them feel like they don't exist and not worth their attention. There's so many things that happen. Then they get decision paralysis, or, all this other stuff that goes on. So that process of having ADHD, along with the fact that it's has an underpinning physiologically, gives you this feeling of never being good enough, of constantly feeling guilt in relationships, of all of your behavior, your symptoms being taken as character traits. And as a person with ASD, I can relate to that. Having everyone think that I was a jerk, that I was being imperious or condescending, or had a special interest in language early on. And I would just use these Brobdingnagian words, and people thought that I was being a jerk. But for me, it was almost like echolalia, like I liked the sound of something and I was just repeating it, and I really liked that word. I got attached to it, and so I used it 10 times the next 6 months. And it's funny because you get attached to the way that something sounds and it makes you feel, and then it makes you want to share it with other people, even though that's the thing you probably shouldn't do. So that was hard for me, because that expression of my neurodivergence was making people negatively assess me. But for a person with ADHD, it's crushing. It's totally crushing, because they never feel
because
good
of that rejection sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's so much in that, really, that I feel is maybe wrong with this world that we live in. This
where to begin?
This fallacy of normality. We have this conversation in our house quite regularly. I think it was Patsy Cline that said normal is a setting on the dryer, and that's one of my she wrote a book about it, actually.
That's great. My favorite one on that line is Hamlet. I am but mad northwest. When the wind is southerly, I know a hawk from a handsaw.
Well, that's even better.
Yeah.
And I think that's what fundamentally, even from school level, what is this normal, or this neurotypical? I don't
come
feel
from
that
an evolutionary system that favors the pack tribal mentality of wanting to find other people like us. So that means that we're going to punish other people for being different as a default, unless we fight it.
So that's then I'm completely weird, because I prefer the ones that stand out and are of other cultures and languages and skin colors and all that, and maybe I would have been one of the
but it wasn't always that way. Like if you look like culturally, like anthropologically, let's say, and you go back 10,000 years, that neurodivergent person that was in the tribe, maybe they became the shaman, maybe they became the medicine man or medicine woman. There were social roles there that were available for people who were different. And we have marginalized some of that, moving into the modern era, or learn to place less value on those people as we move into a different era. And I think that one of the things that we did right in the ancient world is that if a person was still able to take care of themselves and survive, we gave them a way to fit into the tribe. Whether you're speaking to the that whole liminal phase progression in anthropology, where you're moving from like the younger generation to the older, the coming of age, and as long as you're able to go through that process, then you will get respect and recognition of social unity, even if it ends up that you're neurodivergent and see the great eagle in the sky talking to you. Maybe they just put you in a teepee at the end of the at the end of the river, and then people go there for advice when they've run out of normal options. That's it's interesting though, because if you look at those people that, let's say they're autistic, right? Or they're somewhere on the spectrum. Well, they develop special interests. So if we know a whole bunch about herbs and, the different cycles of the moon and all of that, and the stories of the ancient spirits and the ancestors, maybe that person is a font of knowledge. Maybe that's the nonlinear thinker that the people go to when the linear problems aren't cutting it.
Well, exactly. And I think that's my difference in definition, or my difference in view between a tribe and a community. For me, a community has this white picket fence and a security guard at the door kind of effect, where in a tribal situation, the elders sit around the fire and share their experiences and stories, and the crazy moon lady is living in her teepee and providing a spiritual aspect to the people. So there's places and spaces for each individual, and not, okay, well, we all need to do this, and if we can't follow these rules, then we need to take that pill or that whatever.
But we are moving from that tribal mentality to a community mentality because of the world stage, because of the population, because of disparate, communities and cultures and groups. We have to move away from that tribal mindset, but we forget what we have lost in the process and what we might want to bring with us from that tribal mindset to the community mindset, so that we don't lose what is essential.
Yeah. Or we might be moving back towards that tribal mindset.
I hope not.
No,
I hope not, because when you have a tribe and it's a specific tight-knit family, then that means that our ability to look at, and this is what happens with people who get like a neurodivergent diagnosis, then they'll go and hang out with a bunch of other people who are neurodivergent because they want that tribal mechanism. But then they start to say bad things about the neurotypical people and how frustrating they are, and start to denigrate them so they can elevate themselves. And then it almost starts to become schizotypal, and they only want to be, separate and treated by other people who have that same perspective. And then you're right back to the tribal mentality. And the problem with those familial ties is that they trigger involuntary interactions in the brain with regard to people who are outside of that group. And I would rather take the things that work super, super well from that tribal mindset, ancestral stories, the value of cultural identity, the ability to integrate a neurodivergent person into a tribe, and take those values to the community stage where we have multiple people that are moving from the tribal mentality to the community mentality. Because when we move from the community mentality to the tribal mentality, and we start to separate ourselves from everyone else, and even in the process of us, being in a nonlinear thinking group, eventually we're going to start denigrating people who think in a linear way. Well, they have their own contributions to make too.
No, definitely. Yeah.
And if you have the existential authenticity to be able to make, have different reactions and stuff that don't necessarily agree with your experience, that's great for you. But there's also value to the other's perspective too. There's a desire to self-elevate. We are the chosen people. And if you do that, that process of othering, even using the words, will start to affect your behavior.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's a different perspective that you and I have. For me, the tribe is the welcoming, the all. You may be looking at from a strict anthropological kind of aspect, and
I have a different experience with the word. Is all that's going on.
Exactly.
I think we're agreeing. We're just using different words.
Exactly. And it's definitely that us and them perspective that is a big issue within any of this, and for me, maybe even within nonlinear thinking or neurodivergence or neurotypical or white and black, and whatever you want to call it.
So you're saying a global tribe, then, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, so for me, the difference between a tribe and a community is that a community can be several tribes together, whereas a tribe is an individual isolated thing. So if we're going to use global tribe, then I see where we're disagreeing, and bang, there it is. Exactly. So that, I think that takes care of that, clears it up.
Yeah, no, exactly. And just to bring us back kind of a little bit to this trust and building trust, I think we covered it quite a bit around trusting ourselves as well, because it comes from that aspect of understanding ourselves and removing ourselves from our own comfort zones to grow, and to then be able to trust and look outside of our tribe in your kind of perspective.
Whatever parlance you want to use, our limited perspective based on social proximity.
Yes, exactly. And that's what it's used in advertising and marketing and all those things. I can't trust the secondhand car salesman, or the adverts that we get is about showing us people that are like us so that we would buy from these companies, whether it's,
or at least listen to what they have to say.
Yeah, exactly. And also, when we use testimonials, for example, or you have a big speaker or a retreat or a coaching situation, and there's the story, the hero's journey is being told, where
10,000 faces. Yeah.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. From
Look at this
Beowulf to
person.
Gilgamesh to all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all creating stories that we can find empathy with, and triggering those mirror neurons so that we can see ourselves within them.
Yeah, storytelling is a little bit of a lost art in some ways, because we had that tribal experience of being around the campfire and sharing ancestral stories and all of that. And I think that has definitely changed. And there is benefit to learning the stories of those that have come before it. And that's why, I think one of the first things that happens when you have like global conflict is that people start to rewrite the history books, because knowing where you came from does have an influence, and how that history is written. Maybe the first 20 years, people actually live through that experience, they'll know that that's not right. But then another 20 years, and then another 20 years, and it just becomes a completely different narrative. I think that's interesting, and then we start to forget details about important figures or important events and start to only focus on one or two things about them. Like, I remember, and mind you, I'm in my early 40s, so my experience is a little different. But I remember when I was in school, these teachers the story of Helen Keller.
Yeah. The blind,
and the whole miracle worker Anne Sullivan thing.
Yeah.
But no one talks about what happened when she got older. She literally, marched for socialism. Like, there's this whole thing that goes on with her, and we just teach her about this tiny little sliver of her life. And I think that's one of the things that happens with distance without telling those narratives, is we start to just cherry pick these little things and then just create these ideas, these thought forms about things that don't really have a lot of basis in reality. And then it starts to cloud us, not always when we have the first primary experience, but when we start to have those generations that come after, it starts to cloud it. And I think that that's part of our cultural responsibility, but also our social responsibility as a global community, is to preserve those narratives and talk about them and refer to them and learn from our mistakes. So yeah, I think that's definitely an important dynamic too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the goldfish memory situation. We had I made a reference to having a memory of a goldfish, and you showed me evidence that goldfish don't actually have bad memory, and they've so.
But it's just an idiom. It's just an
idiom.
It
is just an idiom, but to have the story behind it. I mean, I love story. I love the fact that we can learn from myths and things like that. I'm busy watching what's it called? Ancient Apocalypse.
Oh boy.
But there's so many similar imagery and stories through different cultures, and I think we perpetuate it in our modern life as well, that we take out certain bits, as you say, from people's lives. But yet it's important to look at the full picture and see the humans for who they were. I watched Marilyn Monroe's.
Norma Jean.
Yeah, that's it, Norma Jean.
Not Brian Warner, Norma Jean. Yeah.
And it was quite upsetting, I don't know how much of it is based on how much truth, but such a sad life. Same with Elvis Presley. I watched his biography the other day, and once again we've taken out these highlights of their lives and gone, wow, look at those people, instead of looking at the full picture sometimes.
With Marilyn Monroe, I would definitely say that there's a lot of evidence of behavior that was caused by trauma. And we mentioned at the very beginning about parenting attachment styles and all of that, like an anxious, disorganized, or anxious ambivalent parenting attachment style, because her personality was so difficult to deal with that she literally gave Clark Gable a myocardial infarction while they were trying to work together, because she was so frustrating. And understanding, when you see a person who has multiple problems, multiple things like that, I think sometimes we forget that trauma isn't people's fault.
Yeah.
And I think that at a certain point, trauma becomes neurodivergence, because once you start to have enough PTSD reactions in the brain and starts to affect systemic, cognitive beliefs, behaviors, and boundaries, and, what your chemical valence is for different neurotransmitters, you essentially are neurodivergent at that point. And it's created changes in the brain. Same thing with like a TBI.
Yeah.
It's understanding that those things change, understanding how important those things can be in manifestations of personality, expression, modalities, boundaries, all of that. There's a famous story here in the States of a railroad worker who had a spike put into his brain, and he
I
ended up
know the
surviving
story.
it.
Yeah, yeah,
And it changed his whole personality and his
yeah.
aggression, and
Well, a lot of personality theory or research has been done on that case as to how the brain functions without certain areas that are of working.
I have a theory. This is just a theory. This is
Yeah.
just my takeaway from a decade and a half. I want to say that our wakeful consciousness is a temporary state that we have evolutionarily evolved so that we can have that first person narrative to make natural selection decisions. And that the reason that we see ourselves as individuals and that we have that wakeful period where we're processing, I think it's the brain flexing. It's the cortex flexing, right? And it can only hold it for so long. After what happens after 3 or 4 days without sleep, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's kind of flexing, and while it's doing that, we have a consciousness. And that consciousness is able to look into the chemically and physically stored memories that are in the brain, and it has that narrative. And because that consciousness is what's looking at it, and it's also what recorded it, we have that sense of linearity. But have you ever considered that maybe if consciousness is a temporary state of flexing the brain, that maybe this is the only day that this consciousness that you have generated for today will be alive, and that tomorrow your brain will generate a new consciousness that draws upon, I think for a long time, and it's like the sci-fi community and stuff, we talked about the matter energy transport conundrum of, if I break this person apart into their disparate energy, and then I transport that to a different distance, and then I reassemble them, does the human narrative survive? Will the conscious being who's here also be the conscious being that's here? Or is sense consciousness and personality and all of that stuff are physically stored in the brain? Will the process of deconstruction and reconstruction essentially create a copy of you after destroying you at one location, and create a copy of you here that in its own mind has a complete linear sense of reality, but you've actually killed the original consciousness? But if consciousness itself is a temporary state of flexing by the brain, and we're all part of the same blanket looking at one another, and all matter is energy and all energy is matter, it might not matter. And it's interesting to take a step back for a second and understand that it is a necessity that we see ourselves as individuals. It is a necessity that we have that perspective in order to be able to make evolutionary decisions, to have individual reactions, to have different reactions inside of a tribe, so that some of us survive if a bad event happens, make different choices, have that variety of expression of genes and experience. But is it truth? I'm literally thinking that I'm sitting here still in a room when I'm actually hurtling through the galaxy at insane speeds. But this desk I'm pounding my fist on isn't actually, it's composed mostly of empty space. And this consciousness that's in my brain may not actually be the reality. The reality might be that this is the temporary state that my brain needs to be in order to process my individual narrative, so that I have the ability to make different decisions than everything else that is around me. And when you start to look at it from that perspective, it changes a few things. I don't know that necessarily everyone would share my perspective on that. It's just my theory, but I do think that there's some truth in that. And it changes the way that you process dreams. It changes the way that you different activity cycles of the brain. And, when you start to get fatigue, and, it starts to explain things in a unique light that I think that explanation fits. I think the difference is that we don't want it to be true.
Do we not? Do we want our consciousness to be continuous? are we our bodies? Are we our brains? Or are we within, I mean, we are thinking that
There's a
metacognitive.
persistent cultural belief in the afterlife,
Mm,
and that this perpetuation of, who we are, what we think, what we do, and our memories are going to move forward into some other plane of existence, even though there is a physiological system that causes our personality and our memories to be stored and manifest. So much so that you can literally push a person down the stairs and it will change the personality for the rest of their life, and they might lose their memory of a week of their life.
yeah.
So if you can show that there's no permanence, that doesn't mean that there's no soul or that there's whatever, that you don't need to make any more sweeping generalizations than that.
Yeah.
But the idea that we somehow get to carry our individuality into a separate plane of existence or experience or after death or whatever, when the truth of reality is more that we are just two different pieces of a blanket looking at one another, it shows you that there is a primal need for individuality, regardless of whether or not that's the truth. There's a primal need for safety, even though, we could literally have an extinction level event tomorrow that we have no way of being able to predict. We've got super volcanoes all over the entire world, and we've got, solar winds and activities and, trans-Neptunian objects that could come in. There's all kinds of crazy things that could happen tomorrow and end the human race. But we can't spend all of our lives thinking about that stuff, or we would never get to live.
Yeah.
There is a certain level at which the anxiety of our own existence doesn't serve to help or protect us. And I think that that's why the brain doesn't need to see all the different spectra of light. It doesn't need to, be able to see through the ground to the other side of the earth. There's no, it's only going to be the stuff that's evolutionary theory that's actually useful information to us. And that narrative, that individual narrative, is only going to be composed of the things that enable that system. And it's going to disregard things that don't. And just being aware of that process, whether you buy into that idea of a temporary consciousness or not, I think it helps inform that psychological approach, because it certainly has for me.
Yeah. And there's a lot of narratives that kind of fit into that as well. Carl Jung talks about individuation as being the path, and that's what you strive
the conscious versus unconscious, and the nature.
That's it, yeah. So kind of combining that, making the subconscious conscious, and that we are tapped into this collective unconscious. So how I, better or grow within myself, I grow the collective unconscious on a level as well.
And buying into epigenetics and the fact that individuality is an illusion, that makes a lot of sense. But then again, a lot of Jung, was more armchair psychology. There's different delineations here, but I think that the evidence definitely seems to support that as a possible conclusion.
Yeah, and I mean, it would be boring if everything was linear and there was only what we saw and what we perceived. Jung was also an alchemist, which is something I'm very interested in. So, yeah, I think.
Yeah, and I'm inspired by Nikola Tesla. He and I actually share a birthday.
Oh, amazing!
And, I always find him really interesting because, not only do we share a birthday and kind of have like a similar, intellect and whatnot, but the reactions of people to him, some of the struggles I've had with people in the past, his battle with Edison and all of that. Yeah. And then later on in life, he became increasingly neurodivergent. And, at the end of his life, he fell in love with a pigeon, there's this whole narrative that happened.
Yeah.
And I think that I kind of feel like I'm living Nikola Tesla's life in reverse, where I became I was a social recluse and didn't understand, social relationships and all of that. And then I finally came into my own. And I feel like he kind of went in the opposite direction. So we're kind of like mirror images of one another. But I got into electrical engineering, and I think that this is where I realized simplistic metaphors really bother me. I was taking a mechatronics and an integrated circuits class. We're talking about transistors and circuits and all of that, and they kept on trying to use the metaphor of plumbing, like it was the flow of water, and that was supposed to make more sense to me. And I was like, look, I understand that that's the level that you have to this, because you don't know who's going to take this class, but like, I can't take in, 2 semesters of this class in a lab and come out of it with an understanding that it's like a plumbing pipe. Like, you've got to do better than that for me, or I'm just going to drop the class. And I ended up having to go to the chemistry professor who, for the class that I wasn't even taking, and get her to explain the intermolecular collisions, valence systems, like electron-free states, everything from dissociated electrons and like theoretical liquid metallic hydrogen to all kinds of stuff. I had to get an understanding of that so that I could go back to that class and be okay, because the instructor wasn't able to actually explain it to me, because that metaphor is so ubiquitous that was his understanding of electron flow as the instructor. Yeah. And so I had to dig deeper. And I think that we all need different kinds of details in order to be able to synthesize and to learn. But understanding underpinning systems always seems to bring up the quality of the conclusions that rise above it and the understanding. And it can help you explain things in different modalities and levels and stuff too. Plus, it can make you a better object of trust. Yeah. Knowing where things come from and being able to explain individualized questions and narratives and to understand different perspectives and where, cognitive beliefs come from and all of that. I think that kind of sapience makes you more trustworthy. Yeah, because there's an element of connection. There's an underpinning, as you say. And then, so with regard to all of that, what does that look or sound like? What I teach in rapport building is I teach people to look at pace and focus. Is this person a more rapid communicator, or are they a more deliberate communicator? Are they using, what's their focus? Do they use more thinking, logically based language, or do they use more feeling based language? Because you want to speak that same language with them to be able to move in and out of their peer group. Because we just talked about all the importance of peer dynamics for trust, right? Yeah. And then when you move into persuasion, I start with emotional triggers and emotional dynamics, because those systems have to be addressed before we can get into the logical systems of the higher brain functions, because you can't talk someone out of a position that they didn't, with reason, that they didn't use reason to get to it in the first place. If you're trying to logically solve their emotional objections, you're not going to get anywhere. So you have to understand their emotional state. And the only way that you can do that is by asking the right questions and knowing how important those emotional reactions are as they move into that process of persuasion and trust and rapport building. Yeah. And therefore picking up the cues and listening really. Just to bring it full circle to the magic of trust. The reason that we're talking about all these individual narratives and the tribality and the individual experiences versus external and peer groups and all of that is to really nail down that process of building rapport and trust, which is to give that other person the emotional and genetic valence, even to be able to recognize you as close enough to them that they can look at you as an individual instead of looking at you oppositionally, and see you as a version of themselves in one manner or another, in order to be able to better listen to what you have to say and to actually consider what you have to say. Yeah, exactly. Anshar, that was amazing. I think we need to do more of these. Sure, anytime. It would be lovely to. This is my autistic special interest, so this for me is just a vacation. Just going to sit and talk about psychology for an hour and a half. That's great. More of that, please. That would be lovely. I think a regular chat around maybe aspects of this kind of trust building and rapport building, and how we get to understand. I think it is inherent in how we understand ourselves as to how we can understand and accept others for being different, because we are all different and the same. Speaking of trust specifically, I have a lot more to share on that, because we could talk about the hegemonic and counter-hegemonic elements in society where we're moving from like the old guard to the new guard, and how the newer generation tends to devalue or push aside the values of the older generation. There becomes this generational gap where people tribally regard their age category versus the new age category. The new kids, look at the kids these days, they're doing this, the Gen Z is this, Gen Z is that. You could talk about the Calhoun's mouse universe experiments and what happens when we get population saturation, and do any of those genetic effects start to manifest on personality in humans, or is that a completely disparate effect, and if it is, then how much? we could talk about the differences in the way that linear and nonlinear people solve problems, and how novel approaches can focus on trust, and that sometimes the people who have nonlinear approaches are the worst at establishing new systems of trust, and therefore their ideas are seen with suspicion. It's difficult for them to get buy-in, and then it can be seen as an attack to an existing system. It's not always that linear people are afraid of new ideas, but they need to be able to hear them and process them in such a way that makes it so that they don't lose the grip on the reins of an organization. And I think that being able to balance that can be intimidating for some people in power, and being able to have a process that they can trust, not just trusting others, but also being able to trust themselves. I did professional magic for a while. That was not just of mine for a while. So I actually have a different level of understanding of trust from that lens as well, as there is, everything from distraction to being able to get close enough rapport with the audience to be able to get them engaged and have the correct emotional reactions to be able to tell a story or something like that. That's certainly involved. And then I also teach public relations, gaining the public's trust, being able to reframe the perceptions that other people have, or getting them to be able to reframe it all. How to be able to take the things that are important, your values, and being able to put them out there in a way that's accessible to other people in order to gain the trust and the credibility. And how different people can see different methods used to get trust. Not everyone wants social proof. Not everyone wants social respite. Sometimes people need to see concrete ideas or where the process something came from. And this is where recognizing the difference in people can get more people to trust you. So there's so many topics that we could branch off in. We'll talk about each of them for an hour and a half, but definitely more to talk about. So
I would love that. It would be amazing if we can explore. I think there's all of those subjects are very interesting, and I'd love to hear your view on it. So yes, please.
Yeah, and I think you'll find rejection sensitive dysphoria really interesting too when you get to actually read some of the research on that, because it's kind of ironic. Like you look at people with ADHD, and maybe a good treatment for them is to take the same pill at the same time each day, and yet who has the trouble with being able to adhere to a schedule and be able to regulate impulses? Here's this person who needs to take the medicine at a certain time each day, and you're literally asking the person who's got the biggest challenge with doing that to do that. It's the same thing with rejection sensitive dysphoria. You're put at this intense disadvantage with others in social relationships when you have ADHD, because your behavior is taken as communication, your symptoms are being taken as character traits, and you are constantly being negatively evaluated by other people. And then your brain is especially susceptible to that negative evaluation. So it's just kicking you when you're down, and I think that is something that happens, to a lot of people who are neurodivergent for different reasons, and for instance, me being on the spectrum, as I got more, because I didn't even own a cell phone until I was like 30 years old, because I didn't have anyone to talk to. Like I was so isolated and so not social. But then I found out that I can't actually handle being on a phone, that the sounds and it triggers my synesthesia, and I have to experiment with different earbuds and all this other stuff. And it's having something on my ear or near my face bothers me, and so here I am trying to move through this system and be able to connect to other people, only to find I have brand new roadblocks that make it even harder for me to do it. So it's definitely an interesting system of exploration.
I can imagine. And you are brave enough to be out there and trying all these things, which creates, if we look at it, it creates a new world for all people, really, to see your bravery and your courage in exploring these solutions.
Yeah, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the ability to confront it.
That's it. Yes. And that's a quote by one of my favorite people. Thank you, Anshar. I hope we will definitely soon as you have a minute. I know you're traveling next week.
4,400 kilometers back and forth every other month. But 100%, I would absolutely love to appear again. And if we can maybe get some feedback from your audience, see if there's anything in particular that they want us to cover or focus on, because we could spend an hour on any of these
I know.
topics. And in even the level that we've discussed, and we've gone to maybe like a two-year max, 4-year college kind of level talking about that. But even just talking about like dopamine-led systems of behavior, or talking about the roles of different neurotransmitters, and how that gets tied into the endocrine system and some of our physiological responses to stress, or things that could trigger our trust system, end up changing the patterns of our cognition, our pattern recognition, our memory, all of that. We could spend an hour just talking about that. There's new research, for autism, for some of the neurophysiology of autism that recently has come out just in the last 2 years, talking about everything from corpus callosal thickness to differences in size in different regions of the brain, and how it might affect our processing, but also why it might lead to things like misophonia and other things in neurotypical. So there's all kinds of stuff to talk about. So I'm definitely down to have any of these conversations. It sounds like fun.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.